Okay, I'm Dominic Jones with Certek Heating Solutions. This is a graph of one of our more recent hot oiling jobs we performed for a customer. Hot oiling is not what you think. We don't have hot oilers. We have glycol hydronic heaters, much safer, much more efficient. We call this process hot oiling because customers often bring us in all around the country and in Canada to heat oil to do one of several things. Thin it out, release gases, separate particulates from it, all associated, sometimes just getting rid of ice shelves that are caught in the bottom of these tanks, all associated with getting rid or bring it to market rather, so they can actually get it to market or so that they can fetch a higher price. Now this is something that we provide to all of our customers. This is just a graph of kind of how our heating goes, and you know, our customers, this doesn't necessarily help them with the sale or anything like that, but a lot of times the pumpers and supervisors like to see this data so that they can better schedule, better see how our process works, and we like it too. This helps us determine if we're in a high altitude, if the wind is going to be heavy, if it's going to be cold. All that affects your ability to heat exchange and how fast it's going to go, so you can schedule and stuff like that. So we're looking at this, and of course this, since we supply this to our customers, it struck me maybe I should put these online and let others kind of see how this goes. Of course, you're not going to see who this was for, what their tank name, all that stuff. This was a 200 barrel tank. It was pretty much full. This was in Colorado, and we're almost at 6,000 feet. A lot of these will look a lot cleaner. This one's a little anomalous, and we'll get into why that is. But the most important thing that we're going to be looking at, that you're always looking at when you're heating a tank, is you want to see this. Where is it? The oil supply from tank. So I'll go over these real quick. What we're looking at is we use a heat exchange process. We use propylene glycol, food grade glycol. You could drink the stuff, tastes terrible, don't recommend it. So glycol supply, that's the glycol as it is coming out of our system. So our system, we like to top it out right around 180 degrees. So when you're running full bore, you're going to be right around 180. So you're going to watch for this, and that's this line right here. Oil supply from the tank. Now that's as you're getting the oil from the tank. Of course, as it starts out, it's going to be very cold. Typically it's below, the freezing point of water. Of course, oil is still liquid at that point. But that's actually the main one, because we'll look at our oil supply or return to the tank. That's coming right out of our system. That's going to be hot. But you want to see this oil supply from the tank, because when that starts being hot, then you know you are reaching the temperatures you want in the tank. Okay, oil flow rate, that's basically how fast are we moving it through our heat exchanger. Usually we're going up to about 4 barrels a minute topping out, but we don't usually need to run it that fast. Glycol return, that's our glycol supply is imparting heat to the oil, and we're measuring what it's returning back at. Oil return to the tank, now that's, we've just heated it just seconds ago, and it's going into the tank at what temperature. Tank side, that's something new on this chart. We haven't really been charting that up till this point. That's a little crazy, and it's because there was an ice shelf. So we're actually trying to measure and gauge below this ice shelf, which is where our oil is going. That's just because that's where the return valve is. And then above this ice shelf, and that creates a barrier that sometimes if you can't get through that ice shelf of water, you're gonna be reading 2 different temperatures. So that's why we're measuring that. VFD hertz, That's just a VFD controls our pump through a heat exchanger, so that correlates to our flow rate. Ambient temperatures, temperature outside. You know, these tanks are insulated. I don't know the R value of the insulation. That's something I should find out from our clients. But ambient temperature, if it's really cold, it might affect it, but it's just something we like to gauge, especially you know, if the ambient temperature has been warm, like if you're heating in the summer, which we often do, it's just going to take less time, less energy. If it's in the winter and you're starting out at, you know, below 20 degrees, it takes a little bit more time. Ambient pressure affects our unit. We're dealing with liquids and heat and all that. You know, we're at about 6,000 feet, so not too high. We run this office in Grand Junction, Colorado, which is about 4,500 feet anyway. And then wind speed. Again, with an insulated tank, doesn't affect it too much, but it's something we like to track. So, starting out, glycol supply. So you're seeing it. We're starting. So we already have this unit prepped and heating before we set up and before we really break circulation. So we're at 140. Now, of course, you're starting a heater. If you're starting it cold, it's going to be a lot less than that. But we're starting at 140 by the time we hook into this tank. And you can just see we're measuring at 20-minute increments. So this went from about 10 to 4, a little longer than we had expected. And that's because originally we were just going to get this tank up to 90 degrees. And you can see it gets a little funky right around here. That's because, actually right around here, that's because when the pumper came and checked it, we got to that temperature. You can see this. So here's the oil supply. You can see it's climbing with the glycol. Climbing. Now right around here is when I think we had this ice shelf that we were dealing with fall. And so it fell into our oil. We see a little bit of dip right there. But then it starts climbing. We wanted to get to 90 degrees. So we're right here. And we're holding. We're probably about to shut down, but we've got the pumper coming and checking. They like the temperature, but this is when they hadn't been using this tank quite a bit, and so he wasn't that familiar with it. When he took a look at it, there was just tons of scaling, stuff from the bottom of the tank, just lots of sludge. So he asked if we would pump it up to 125, which you can see. So we stayed and did that. And also asked if we could switch from the load and return, switch our hoses, because their load valve was ending up starting to get filled with just a lot of that scaling, as it was all kind of getting sucked to that one spot. So we switched that, and we'll get into that in a second. That's where you can see our VFD drop, and we brought it back because we shut our system down for that process. So this is going, so I want to help you understand these dips right here. So our glycol's getting up to temperature, hits 180, hits high fire temp. Now we have an automatic thermostat on it, so you can set that to whatever you want, but we've got it set to our highest at 180. When it hits that, hangs out there for a while, and it actually turns off. So you see this little dip, goes down to like maybe 70, I think, at this point, and then it comes back on, goes back to 180. Sits for a while, dips, back to 180, and it's sitting here for a while. Now that is really just how our system works. You set it, they're designed to set it and forget it. So for these processes, because they're only a few hours long, we do have a technician on hand the whole time. But when we're doing heat trace, things like that, where they're going to sit for months, you can set these and forget these. And as long as they're fueled up, as long as you're taking care of the generator and stuff, they just run, and they'll just do this all day and keep you thawed out. Next, oil supply from the tank. And we kind of talked about that a little bit. So we're starting out pretty cold. Looks like we're starting out about maybe right around freezing, 30 degrees maybe. But quickly we start climbing. Sometimes I don't climb that quickly. We're climbing. Here's where I think we hit that ice shelf. I think it dumped in, so we got some of that cold water with it for a little bit, where we dip down a little bit. But then we just start climbing. Here's where we hit that 190, and so we're holding for a little bit. Pumper's checking that out. This is when the pumper's asking us, hey, can you push through and go a little bit longer and get us up to 125? So we switch some things around and we just climb again. And you can see our glycol supply is pretty much staying constant right here. But we're still just climbing as we're adding heat. And then we are topping this guy out right around where they're asking 125. I think we got up to 127. Dips for a little bit here, not quite sure why it dips right there, but then we get right back to there. And sometimes you just get anomalous readings. So, and that is really the most important line, because that's where when you consistently are getting oil from the tank at the temperature you want, you know you are circulating that entire tank and you're at where you're at. Oil flow rate. Now that correlates, like I said, with the VFD hertz. So down here, I think this is it. This would be it. It's really smooth. We're just running at 2-3 barrels a minute. And that's really all you need. You start kind of low, maybe 1-2 barrels a minute. And then as your pump warms up and you start really noticing you're adding heat, you up it a little bit, and then you just kind of let it fly. Glycol return. Now that's this guy. So this is always going to be a little bit lower. So you always want to be, you don't want to be less than 170, because that's kind of that dip here on your glycol supply. If you're going lower than 170, it means maybe your unit's locked out, you need to turn it back on or something like that. This, you don't really want to be less than, say, 130 while you're doing this. There's always going to be this little gap, and they kind of correlate as you see. So this is climbing. So as we're imparting heat, we're losing that glycol heat and it's dropping down. So it's at 120 when we're starting. But it climbs as this climbs, climbing up to probably 150-ish here. As it turns off, dips here. Don't notice much of a dip right here with that dip. And then it really climbs, and then you can see this is where your oil is not taking much more heat. So it is not, this is in that zone where we had to switch everything out. So the return, it didn't lose much because there was no oil for it to impart it to. So it's approaching the supply heat. Then as we get it back, switched back, now you're seeing it's losing heat again as it's adding. Next, oil return to the tank. Now this spikes really quick and you can see it. That's because it's fresh out of the gate, out of our heat exchanger, back into the tank, and we're measuring it right at the valve when it enters the tank. So yeah, it starts low, but it's actually pretty high. I mean, this is 90 degrees. So you can see if it started, oil supply from the tank started at 30, one trip through our heat exchanger, it's already up to about 90. And then it's just climbing every time because it's getting hotter and hotter as it keeps returning through there. Goes up, dip here. This is where you're losing. These ice shelves aren't one thing. If you can imagine just kind of a ring of ice, or even like a plane of ice. Different parts can be dumping off at different times. So there's a little dip right here, goes up and up, and then you're turning, higher than your supply still. and that's just going up. Now the sides of the tank. Now these are the strange ones, and these are the ones it's going to take a little bit more time to interpret, because you're seeing. So, and we're hitting where we think is below the ice shelf and above the ice shelf. So below the ice shelf should heat up really quickly because it's getting direct contact with the hot oil that we are throwing in there. Above the ice shelf is on the other side of that barrier. And so it's taken time to punch through that. And you do see that in this chart where immediately below that ice shelf starts rising, mimicking all these up here, rising, kind of peaks. This is where I think part of that ice shelf dumped off and got into kind of down towards the bottom, and because that temperature dropped, and then it rises, and then as we got temperature on our supply, we stopped taking data points for that. So you can see above the ice shelf, it's a little colder. It is rising, but much slower. You're seeing it kind of jump up and down, up, and then it actually crosses this and gets higher, and then we stop taking data points. With EFD, we kind of talked about that. That's just reading it in hertz and said the ambient temperature, we didn't have much temperature change over the course of this job. So you can see down here, this was the temperature. It was, I want to say it was 25 degrees to start. You can see it's jumping up. It's just barely staying above freezing this whole time. Now this is, early March in Colorado, and so you're still pretty cold, especially at that elevation. Ambient pressure, we're about 11, 12 psi this entire time, so not much change there, and you can see that didn't really affect all these other numbers. And then we've got the wind speed, and that was really low. I think it was 1-2 miles an hour. It gets up to maybe 3, maybe 8 or 9 miles an hour, and then dips back down. So a little windy around 2 o'clock, and dips back down. So the main takeaway from this chart is basically to see how long this takes. So to get from where this oil is starting at, let's just say it's starting at 30 degrees. We hit 90, which is what our request was, and 1, 2, 3, looks like 4 hours. And then to get to 125, and that was with shutting down for at least 20 minutes, half an hour while we're doing some things. What did I say, 4 hours, another really 5 hours. We just kind of kept it there for good measure. And again, this supply is what you're looking at, and that's the key, what you want to get to. You want to keep these levels good, and that is basically, like I said, this was an anomalous tank. Typically, they'll come and get these tanks the next day. They'll have a truck first thing in the morning, and so what I like to do is get one last data point from the pumper, and they'll measure what the temperature was when it was picked up. And usually, if you're leaving the tank, say you're leaving the tank at noon, and it's 120 degrees, which is typically your target rate, they're still picking it up the next day after a cold winter night at between 90 and 105, I'd say, degrees Fahrenheit. This is all in Fahrenheit, and that is perfect for taking it to market. So this is just a little taste of the back end of heating a tank with Certek. 4 or 5 hours to get from below freezing to 120, 125 degrees, and then you are good to go. If you ever have any questions, please feel free to contact us through our website or give us a call if you'd like to heat a tank. Like I said, we heat tanks from Texas, Colorado, out east, up north, up in Canada, all over the country. And we use this same heat exchanger process. It's extremely safe. Not dealing with pressures, not dealing with extreme temperatures. You're dealing with slow and steady that gets the job done in a safe and efficient manner. We can run on, we're tri-fuel, we can run on diesel, propane, or natural gas. So you pick your poison there, and we can show up and leave, and then you have a hot tank.